So, the different types of power are good ways of thinking about how conflict occurs, right? We talked last class, last week in particular, about how conflict can be a good thing, right? But that conflict is a way of dealing with some problems, including groupthink. The thing that we haven't talked about yet, that I really want us to build on, is the idea that a lot of the conflicts and issues that we have with each other and why they're so thorny and complicated is because of the role of power, right? Not all relationships are necessarily equal or feel even between parties. And oftentimes, the relationships and conflicts we have within those relationships feel at their worst when we're feeling power imbalances, right? A lot of challenges between a parent and child. Because power is not even between those people, it can be a big challenge. One problem that we've seen a lot, and we've seen a lot of discourse about over the past several years, right, is like a supervisor or employer-employee relationship, right, teacher-student relationship. All of those things have a lot of complications and challenges to them because of the role that power plays in the relationship. So I think this week is a great way for us to think about how power can impact our communication process. It will also help us to look at how different forms of conflict management are present in different cultures. So referent culture is the best answer to this question because it gets at the role of things like charm, charisma, and your sort of natural abilities. So this is a good way to think about it because referent power is the idea that you could have no actual formal power or authority over anybody else, right? It's just based on your ability to connect with other people, to be trustworthy to other people, and so on. Coercive power, right, gets much more at the role of a stick or a punishment for not following the rules, something like timeout. Legitimate power essentially deals with the specific formal role that somebody has. So for instance, if somebody is a lawyer and they have the ability to prosecute somebody or defend somebody in a court of law, right? They have that legitimate power because they've earned that degree and they occupy that title within a court. And then a reward is more providing a good incentive for completing a task. So we'll talk about these 5 categories in a little bit more detail and focus on them more today. Before we do that, just as a quick recap of the things that we went over last class, we used class on Monday as a writing workshop, which is an opportunity for us to understand some ways to improve on writing skills. I used a lot of the feedback that you all provided in that form about issues or questions that you might have in terms of writing and writing ability. So we talked about some of the ways to do writing effectively, including some group opportunities to look at good writing strategies. We also talked about bad writing. So for instance, things such as passive voice, and writing styles that just feel too convoluted. And then we also talked about some of the major assignments in the class, including the term paper. One thing that I want to direct you toward is you might have noticed that I posted an announcement on Canvas earlier for the study circle groups. So I've mentioned that one of our major assignments in the class is to do a study circle where you and a few other students in the class will essentially be talking about a topic that might have some disagreement. I know that can be a little bit weird, a little bit scary, a little bit uncomfortable, but I think that we'll be able to do so in a way that is respectful and follows the ideas in the class, and it's a great way for us to apply and use a lot of these conflict management strategies we've talked about. So we'll be doing that a little bit later on in the class. And I've had you take a look at that form and hopefully complete it by Friday so that you can let me know any times that you wouldn't be able to meet, since I know a lot of folks have athletic or extracurricular things that are happening, and anybody who strongly wants to work with anyone else can also submit that to me. So I linked it on Canvas earlier. Please complete it by Friday if you can. Next week, I'll give you the opportunity to meet and get to know some members from your study circle so that you can start to get going on that. For this class, we're going to cover a couple of the things that I wasn't able to get to on Friday about ethical listening and the role of study circles. We'll then talk about the role of power in communication, what it does, why it matters, why it oftentimes can feel so uncomfortable. And we'll look at several different examples of how these different power management styles end up happening. So I have this kind of long list that we weren't able to really talk about in a whole lot of detail. And again, I'll have these slides up later after class, so you don't need to have those down word for word. But this ties pretty closely to the role of power in conflict management, right? Because in order to be effective at managing and engaging in conflict management, we need to control the environment. If it's an environment where a lot of people are eavesdropping, jumping in on the conversation, and so on, it can be really comfortable. If it's somewhere unsafe or where people don't feel like they can advocate for their issues, that'll be a big problem too. Being present in the moment is important. Oftentimes we deal with like physiological noise or other things going on in our heads that might make us distracted and unable to understand the perspectives of other people. Letting people hear themselves out. So oftentimes if we have a point of view that we disagree with, we kind of have this preemptive drive where we immediately want to understand, we want to jump to respond to what somebody has to say, rather than taking the time to fully listen to what they have to say. If you've ever finished somebody's sentences or have had that happen to you, right, it can sometimes feel frustrating if how you're ending something is not the way that they've finished the sentence for you, right? Asking for help with unfamiliar words is a good idea, right? Again, it goes back to one thing in this class, there's no dumb questions, right? If you don't understand something, oftentimes you're compelled to just kind of follow along, and that prevents us from critically thinking or assessing the topic. Taking notes, if you can, is a really good idea. One thing that you might consider in something like a job, if you have regular meetings, is to do meeting minutes, right? So if in your job you don't already do this when you have like some type of staff meeting, or you anticipate, a job where you have these kinds of regular meetings, tracking minutes is a great way to go back to your previous communication, figure out what was going on. It also helps a lot because a paper trail avoids a he said, she said situation where there's a lot of competing claims, but there is no way to track those. Clarifying questions can help, right? Helping you to understand the material. Thinking about and remembering the issues or topic that's at play is super important, right? If it's easy to get off topic and to focus on something else, then it's harder for us to resolve the conflict. We can also oftentimes summarize facts. So one strategy, it's actually really helpful whenever you engage in a one-on-one conflict with somebody or you're in a situation where you're disagreeing with someone and it's frustrating, is asking the other person to restate what you just said. One thing that happens a lot, right, is that you're talking and arguing with somebody else, misunderstand what they're saying, you don't feel listened to, forcing somebody else to kind of recap what you just said is a way to check in and make sure you're understanding each other. No, that's not what I said at all. I was actually talking about this problem, right? That can help us resolve our ambiguity in communication. Remember the feelings behind the messages, right? So a lot of times, if somebody feels very passionately about something, there's a genuine reason that they care and want to be involved. Acknowledging those feelings and emotions, right? Not in a patronizing way. I can tell you're upset, right? That's probably not very good, but saying, look, I can tell this is an emotionally charged topic. I've had questions before about like how do you engage in a conflict when it feels like the other members of the group do not relate to you or are coming from a totally different world. Taking that time to listen and understand how somebody else is feeling is a good idea. And preventing evaluations or rush to judgment, right? Don't immediately judge somebody else. Take the time to listen to what they have to say. These are kind of general skills to help us for managing communication. There'll be things that will be helpful for you as you work on your own study circles for this class. And there are also ways that we can think about some of the challenges of power in communication too. So, a study circle, right, does not mean that you have a group of people that you need to study for an exam with or anything like that, although you can certainly do that too if you want. A study circle is instead a term that's used in conflict management to describe a group of people that discuss an issue of which some members might disagree. So a study circle could look like something like a focus group. So for instance, a lot of times, a lot of companies will do focus groups where they put people in a room. They ask them, okay, how do you like this toothpaste? And they do a focus group to see how people will talk to each other, bounce off each other, or disagree with each other, and so on. They like that conversation because it allows people to share more than they would in a one-on-one interview or something like that. So a study circle talks about an issue and has a conversation. People might be similarly on the same page, people might disagree on things, but it's an opportunity to do so respectfully. And as a part of that, you have a study circle facilitator. So a facilitator is somebody that occupies a role of helping the discussion happen. So oftentimes, it can be easy for us to think about a facilitator as having this really domineering role in our communication. And that's actually not what it should be. In fact, if we think back to last week in the Bay of Pigs example, a lot of the way that that went wrong was because the president had too large of a role, right? He was actively in discussions, he was intervening, he was saying, I want this, right? So a study circle facilitator is not necessarily trying to direct, right? And not trying to impose their opinion onto the discussion, but is instead there to make the discussion flow smoothly. So rather than, having like a maestro who is directing people on how to play a specific song, it's more like having, a free jam session where you have somebody that's helping and saying, this sounds good, ooh, you should join in. You should play this instrument, right? They're not directing a rigid song, they're empowering people to play however they like. So study circle facilitator doesn't say a lot, but they're allowing the discussion to happen. They're giving people the opportunity to share and say, hey, look, Susan, let's hear from you. Why don't you share your thoughts? You avoid personalizing disagreements. So instead of saying, Dan, everybody hates you, you're so obnoxious, right? They say, well, it looks like we're on a heated discussion. Let's shift gears. So also, right, explaining why somebody might be feeling offended or hurt by a topic is really important. One kind of useful day-to-day interpersonal strategy for conflict management, the idea of the Jefferson rule, right? So maybe somebody says something that really is upsetting and bothering to you, and you feel very heated. You have this emotional fight or flight response, right? Give yourself 10 seconds. Count to 10 seconds in your head before you say something bad. Another approach is an email, right? If you've ever received an email that's really frustrating or has you angry, give it 24 hours before you reply back to the email, right? So giving that opportunity is important. Hearing from everybody saying, look, I don't think you've had the chance to say a whole lot. What would you like to add to the conversation? Because a lot of times, especially when we factor things like gender, culture, and so on into the equation, some people can feel like they don't have as much of an opportunity to speak, make their voice heard. And, right, group members can add their own rules on how to participate in the study circle. So one way that a lot of conflicts are managed is the idea of stacking. So stacking is where you kind of have a list, and somebody might, raise their hand to be added to the list, and you just go down the list on who to speak. You can also do this thing where if you do kind of like your hand partially up or to the side, you can add a comment to the existing conversation. Not everybody has to manage conflict in that way, but stacking is oftentimes a useful strategy if it feels like a conversation or discussion is getting off track, it doesn't feel like people are connecting, people are talking over each other a lot, and so on. You've probably heard or seen a similar idea with like the talk stick, right, where it goes around to certain people and only the person holding the stick can speak at that moment. So those might be rules that people choose to add depending on how the conversation is going. So I kind of want to pose to the class as a whole, shifting gears a little bit to power. When you think about power in general, what is power? What are some examples of power that individuals might have over other people? Yeah, right, like governmental authority, military power.
So like economic, like a boss at a job.
Yeah.
Environment.
Yeah, right? There's a couple different elements at play. There's both this sort of professional role that they have, as well as the level of economic power that they could have over you too. Other thoughts? Economic, we have this sort of like governmental level, we have this kind of professional level. Parents, right? So parents do have, both kind of this informal and formal power. And one of the things interesting about a lot of parent-child relationships is the way that it shifts over time, right? Where this kind of power almost evens out in a lot of situations, right? As a child gets older, grows up, becomes more financially independent. And so there's a lot of ways that, the relationship can develop in other areas that might not be based on those power relationships. Another thing that I'd identify is the example that we used for today's quiz, right? The charisma and charm that somebody has too plays a really big role. You think about anybody who has become like a president, a governor, a senator, and so on, right? In order to get to where they were and kind of started from a role of not really holding an elected office to getting eventually to that point, right? A lot of referent power was used to get there. There was some type of charm or charisma or relationship that was established that was able to help that person reach those goals. So money, right, was brought up as a really big example of power. Oftentimes, if we feel financially dependent or we have a financial relationship with somebody, we might feel really upset or hurt on the role that power plays in that relationship, right? If you're renting a home or renting an apartment, right, and you have a landlord who is not responding to your messages, is not letting you, get this lamp fixed or whatever else, you're going to feel frustrated because you know they have some level of financial control or power over you, and that might not make you as willing to push as aggressively to get that fixed done. Military power can play a big role too. Force, such as physical force, right? If you, push somebody to the front of the line, or, physically hurt somebody, right? That fits under power too. Again, charisma, charm, so on plays a role. Persuasion, our ability to convince somebody. Specialized knowledge and expertise plays a really big role too, right? Oftentimes somebody has power if they have a unique authority, an ability to talk about an issue based on their own experience. So power put together is our ability to control or influence how other people behave, act, so on, right? So I want to unpack a little bit about how power can impact our process of conflict management. Do so in a few ways, right? Pictured here is the excavation of what are known as conflict minerals. Does anybody know what a conflict mineral is? Yeah. Yeah. So conflict minerals, right, are things that we see all the time. So, for instance, your phone, your tablet, your device, and so on is kind of made up of a variety of materials, including crystals, to make the liquid crystal display and so on. So there's a lot of areas in the world, including many areas of sub-Saharan Africa, where the minerals used to make things like phones, tablets, and so on are really highly disputed, right? Oftentimes there's high levels of conflict and, at times really unfair labor standards to create and produce a lot of these minerals for broader consumption and purchase from other companies, right? I don't say that to make a value judgment on the devices we use, but instead to say it's an example of the way that conflict happens because of how resources are distributed. Many companies have pushed back and said, we don't want to use this material in our devices if it's helping to fuel some of these conflicts. So conflict emerges because of how power is exercised. How are you using power, right? The idea of abusing power is often seen as a really major role in conflict. If you have a boss that's showing preferential treatment to a coworker and doesn't seem like they're valuing you as a person, right? That's a big source of conflict. Power is relational, right? Power is about our power relative to someone else. We evaluate power and measure power comparatively. Additionally, power, again, relates to resources like literal conflict minerals because there's only so many that can be extracted and used to power devices. That can be a big source of conflict. And we also know that power, right, can be used as an agent of change. Power is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, right? Your classic Spider-Man, great power, great responsibility, blah, blah, blah. But instead, right, how power is used is oftentimes the source of conflict, change, so on in society. You might have seen for today's chapter, right, there's a lot of discussion of Dr. Martin Luther King and the role of things such as civil disobedience and protest play in the ability to achieve political change. So there's a lot of ways that these kinds of power imbalances can negatively impact our relationships and can make our ability to manage and deal with conflict more challenging. One of the easiest examples, right, is that people with a lot of power can refuse to participate. What's in it for me? Why should I bother? This is actually really present in a lot of kind of US Senate or governor or House of Representatives style debates, where if you have an incumbent or somebody who is almost certainly going to win re-election, a lot of times they will refuse to have a political debate, a televised debate with their challenger, because they say to themselves, I'm going to win no matter what. If I go on TV, all I'm going to do is give them some screen time and maybe say something that makes me less likely to win. Why would I do that? So that's something we see a lot. A low power person can refuse to participate out of fear, right? So if you're a tenant and you want to complain about there being cockroaches everywhere, maybe you're less likely to do that because you're worried your landlord will evict you if you speak out. A high power person can just impose their view, right? They can say, this is the way it is. If you have a very kind of strict supervisor at a job and says, you know what, my way or the highway, that can oftentimes deter our ability to do that. And a lot of people who might not have as much power will often try to coalesce and create power before they're willing to talk about or engage in a conflict. One example where we see this a lot is in terms of doing a strike, right? So employees might choose to strike the working conditions of their current place of employment, and they might be unwilling to enter this negotiation period with their employer until they're able to gain enough support from the other members of the group. So again, these kinds of imbalances will oftentimes make us more reluctant to engage in conflict or to talk out an issue, or when we do talk out an issue, it doesn't go as well. Another key idea here is the distinction between power over and power with, right? Power can be a force for good or for bad or for whatever. Power over is what we've mostly been talking about so far, the ability to make others comply or follow along, right? That's the use of things like money, like military power, and so on. Power with, instead, refers to the idea, instead of thinking about it vertically, top down, power over somebody else, you can think about it horizontally, right? Power is shared among a group of people. This was present in a lot of examples, such as Selma, right, as part of the civil rights movement. The march that included many, many activists was an opportunity for power with, because each member of the group was able to contribute to that broader movement. So power with can be used as a way to share power among people in the group to achieve specific goals that members might have. So I mentioned these 5 different types of power, and I just want to unpack them and provide a couple more examples of them to help contextualize those before I ask you to do a short activity as a group. So legitimate or personal power, right, is somebody like a judge. Like if you've ever seen like Judge Judy or whatever, it's very silly. But somebody that has that type of power is going to be able to mediate and direct a court, right? They have a formal role that is enumerated, it's written. Maybe they have, a placard over their door or something like that. It's a formal role that somebody has, like a title. You're a supervisor, you're a president, you're a boss, and so on. One way to think back about this is, the ancient Greeks put forward three logical proofs: ethos, pathos, logos. Ethos is the role of credibility, right? It's the background and authority that you bring to the table. And in a very formal capacity, legitimate or personal power is that type of title and authority that you have. Secondarily, is this idea of referent power, as we brought up, right? It's the charm, it's the charisma, it's what somebody brings to the table, oftentimes if they're starting from nothing, right? In this way, they gain that power regardless of a formal role that they have. How many of you have ever watched or seen the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar? So a few of you. So Julius Caesar, the play, right, is the sort of dramatic reenactment of the historical event, right? So Julius Caesar is murdered. The kind of conspirators are occupying a role of power following this death. And a lot of the public thinks, you know what, Caesar, not a very good dude, right? I understand why you made this decision. Mark Antony, who's very loyal to Caesar, is given the opportunity to give a speech to the public, right? And in this speech, he is literally just relying on his charm, his charisma, his background as a person in order to convince people to turn against the saboteurs. I want to show you just kind of a clip that I think puts into context a lot of this in action. I swear not all of the examples in this class are going to be like old black and white films.
We'll hear him. No one has to
This one makes sense.
For goodness sake, I am beholden to you. He says for goodness sake he finds himself beholding to you. Brutus here, I speak to as a tyrant. Hey, that's certain. Your flesh that Rome is raving. And the Romans. And the Romans hear me. Lend Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it was so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously hath Caesar answered it. Here on the leave of Brutus and the rest, for Brutus is an honorable man. So are they all honorable men. Come I to speak in Caesar's funeral. He was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. He has brought many captives down to Rome, whose ransom to the general coffers filled. Does this from Caesar seem ambitious? When did the poor have cried, Caesar hath wept? Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and Brutus is an honorable man. You all did Caesar on the Lupercal, I thrice presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse. Was this ambition? Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure he is an honorable man. I speak not to disprove what Brutus spoke, but here I am to speak what I do know. You only love him once, not without cause. What cause was hold you then to mourn for him? Oh, judgment! and men have lost their reason. Bear with me, my heart is in the coffin there with Caesar, and I must pause till it come back to me.
What do you do in this class? Oh, we watch black and white videos of men yelling. So this example, right, is, so Mark Antony is back into a corner. Brutus, right, and the other saboteurs who murdered Caesar very much have the support of the people, but he gets the ability to speak. He uses a lot of rhetorical appeals, right? He's like using this, but Brutus is an honorable man, while at the same time talking about how great Caesar was, and is essentially turning the public, right, the other side, and getting them to support him and to oppose the conspirators and so on, right? So this is an example of starting from nothing, using things like those rhetorical appeals, his personal relationship with Caesar, reminding the public of all the things that Caesar did that were good. You know, you have that classic quote, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," right? That starting point. And so that's referent power, right? It's using that, especially if you have no other power there, to start the conversation and to get people to support your cause. Eventually he gains a lot more power, right? He gains the following and support of much of the public who otherwise were totally not where he was at in the beginning. Expert power. So if you're like me and spent a lot of the 90s growing up, which I know not necessarily that many of you, or maybe you've seen Bill Nye reruns, right? Bill Nye the Science Guy, classic TV show that was teaching kids about science. So expert power is just like that, right? You look to certain celebrities, figures, so on, that have a degree of authority on a topic that other people don't have, right? So expert power includes having knowledge and specific understanding of the issue that the general public does not, right? We've seen a lot of sources of both expert power as well as disagreement surrounding COVID-19, right? And a lot of questions about what counts as expertise in that area. But expert power gets to the idea that in our own heads, we feel like the source knows a lot about the topic. As a result, that source has power over us, right? So I do not know a whole lot about the history of a lot of the indigenous tribes and groups that still live here in La Grande, right, and surrounding area. So that is not an area that I have a lot of expertise on. But Dr. Linda Jarofsky in anthropology and sociology knows a lot about the topic, right? So I would lend on her expert power to gain a better understanding of the topic. So I think that's a really good way to think about expert power as us giving somebody credibility and knowledge and trusting them that they have knowledge about something. So if you were ever in grade school and had the thing where there were like the gold stars on the wall, right? You do well, you clean up, you do all your things that you're supposed to do, you have good behavior, you get a gold star next to your name, right? Very silly, but it's a way to reward students for good behavior, right? So gold star is an example of reward power. It's using the carrot rather than the stick, saying, you do what I ask and you'll do well. You work overtime, you'll get overtime hours, you'll get paid for it, right? Reward power is essentially, what do I get for it? So reward power can be really useful as a way of allowing somebody to positively choose to complete a task. The last one, and the opposite, is coercive power. So again, this analogy of the carrot or the stick, do you give somebody something good for doing something? Or do you, use the stick, do you punish them for not doing something well? Or for doing something that they're not supposed to do? Coercive power is just that. It's the stick. It's providing a punishment for doing or not doing a task. So for instance, sending a kid to their room, giving them a timeout, right, is an example of using this kind of coercive power. So, given kind of these examples, what I'd like you to do is you can grab a new sheet of paper for this, or you can type this if you prefer. Sure to include your name either way. Considering the 5 types of power that we've talked about for today, right? Legitimate, preferent, expert, word, and coercive. Which of these 5, in your opinion, is the most useful for conflict management? So if you're talking with and trying to resolve a conflict with somebody, which of these 5 is going to do you the most good? There's no right or wrong answer here. I'm just curious to hear your own opinion. And just take some time to think about that and write your own thoughts on it. I'll give you a few minutes to do that, and we'll talk about this together. I'll give you another minute or two on this. So once you kind of wrap this up and feel like you have a sense of what you feel like is the most useful form of power for conflict management, what I'd like you to do is to find somebody else in the class. You can also form a group of 3 if you prefer. What I'd like you to do is to just share. What did you write about? What did you think was the most important or effective form of power for conflict management? and see if you agree or disagree. So, welcome to take a couple minutes, find somebody, and just chat with them about how your opinion might compare with theirs. So, take a little bit to finish up, since we both of you have wrapped up a lot of points. So I was hearing some really good conversation over here in the middle about kind of how these forms of power relate to each other. You want to share a little bit about you all were talking about?
Yeah, we both agree that direct power is definitely one of the most powerful options, and one of the top options we had was that without that power, without the superintendent of that, we would agree with you, you couldn't get that legitimate power, you think it's position, something like that.
Yeah. I like the way you bring that up as kind of a foot in the door, right? It's sort of, you build that relationship, you had like the Mark Anthony example, right? You don't start with power necessarily, but because you have this opportunity to form relationships, maybe people trust you in positions of leadership, and so on. Seems like there was some good discussion here on this side. Is there any partnership or group you'd like to share kind of on this side?
All three said expert.
Okay.
Like, if you're arguing and having a conversation and over something and one of them is studying that topic, they're going to know more about it and have more knowledge over that topic. So they, I think, have the power in that topic.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Because one of the challenges that we see a lot with like critical thinking, polarization, right, and a lot of like social and political conflicts is what counts as expert power, right? What might be seen as expertise for somebody is not how another person sees this as an expert opinion. And so a lot of figuring out divides in conflict management is figuring out, are we on the same page as being expertise? If we are, right, then we're probably going to defer a lot of things we don't know to that expert, to that leadership. So anybody over here, any partnership or group on this side that would like to share? Yeah.
We actually both said, we're keeping references to experts, but one thing we were talking about is feeling a lot of them are very situational based.
Yep.
Not only what the subject is upon or like location, but like the amount of people that are present as well. Expert would definitely be a lot more viable and more one-on-one conflict, where maybe some facts and kind of information powerful.
Mhm.
Whereas when it's a mass group or kind of this way a large amount of people, restaurant would be a lot more actual because of where it is like Calvin's and get people to kind of jump through this house.
Yeah. It's a really good point, right? So there's no easy or definitive answer to this question because context matters. And I like that you mentioned the size of the audience and group of people, right? Where oftentimes something like your expertise is something that a lot of people in a larger group can see, whereas something like your personal charm or charisma you might use more in a one-on-one setting, right? So there's a lot of different approaches that we might consider. Another big factor that relates to this is personality, right? Whether or not you're the type of person that has a lot of charisma and natural energy that forms connections, whether you're the type of person that's very nose to the grindstone and focused on becoming an expert on the topic, that plays a really big role too. But the reason I had us think about and compare some of these is that, again, it's not one size fits all. There's a lot of different ways to think about how power is impacted by the situation and the context that we find ourselves in. And that's, I think, a really good starting point for us next class to be thinking about the role that culture and some of the differences in Eastern and Western styles of conflict management tend to happen. So to wrap up the things that we've talked about for today, we were talking a lot about some listening skills in study circles, picking up on some of the things we weren't able to get to last week. Again, there's a lot of kind of pointers on how to do effective communication in conflict management, how to listen to and relate to one another well. We talked about how power, right, is not necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's a force that can be exerted either vertically, top down, power over, or power with, where it's shared among a group of people through things such as social movements, civil disobedience, and so on. And then we looked at the different types of power, including the 5 major formats, kind of compared those a little bit, and used some examples to understand how it can impact our relationships, right? So I think power adds an important dimension to how, first day of class, a lot of you mentioned that, you had situations with a roommate, with a friend, with a family member that didn't end well, or didn't really feel like you resolved the conflict. So I think examining power is an important way that we can unpack some of the complications in many of the relationships that we have. So going into today's class, I asked you to read chapter 2 of Jan. I'm not asking you to do additional reading. We'll instead look at kind of the rest of that chapter and the role that culture plays. But going into next class, I do want you to submit that form by the end of the day on Friday if you can. It's a Google form about your study circle preferences and certain dates. Please make sure to complete the syllabus quiz by the end of the day on Friday. It's open note, open book. And then you might just look back through your notes on chapter 2 and refresh on the different types of conflict management styles to help prepare us for the day. Thanks for your discussion and contributions, and I look forward to seeing you all again on Friday.